What if the oldest memories of civilization are not beginnings at all, but fragments left behind after something quietly disappeared? In the Sumerian texts, there is a feeling of interruption, as if knowledge once flowed smoothly and then suddenly thinned, leaving gaps no clay tablet could fully explain. Names appear without origins. Wisdom arrives already aged. Tonight, we move slowly into those silences, not to correct history, but to listen to what it hesitates to say. Settle into the questions and allow the ancient echoes to unfold, one breath at a time. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. Long before the Anunnaki are named, before they arrive already fully formed in the Sumerian imagination, the tablets speak in a quieter way. They do not announce beginnings with certainty. They gesture instead towards something already underway, something inherited rather than created. When the earliest scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, they were not recording the dawn of civilization so much as stabilizing memories that felt older than themselves. Even in their most confident lines, there is a sense that something precedes the gods they describe, an order that does not require introduction because it was never truly gone. The language itself betrays this feeling. Sumerian words for kingship, for law, for sacred order appear without narrative origin. They do not explain how these concepts came into being. They simply exist, as if borrowed from a deeper past. In the earliest administrative tablets from Uruk, dating to the late 4th millennium BCE, writing is already used to manage grain, labour, time, and obligation. Such systems imply long experimentation, generations of refinement, a social memory extending far beyond the first marks we have found. Writing does not emerge here as an invention, but as a response to complexity that has already ripened. This quiet implication unsettles the traditional sequence. If the Anunnaki are framed as civilizers, as bringers of order, why does that order feel pre-installed? Why do temples rise atop earlier sacred mounds, as if sanctity itself had an address long before the gods took names? At sites like Eridu, layers of ritual architecture descend into the earth, each temple built upon the remains of another, reaching back toward a horizon archaeology cannot fully illuminate. The deeper one digs, the less ceremonial the structures become, yet the continuity of place remains. Something held this ground sacred before theology crystallized. The Sumerian king list deepens the unease. Its earlier section does not read like myth in the conventional sense. It reads like a record struggling to reconcile incompatible timescales. Kings reign for tens of thousands of years, not in poetic exaggeration but in measured totals, calculated and repeated across copies. Then, without explanation, a flood intervenes. Afterward, kingship descends again, diminished, compressed, suddenly human in scale. The text does not justify this rupture. It simply accepts it, as if the scribes themselves inherited a narrative already fractured. What is often missed is not the impossibility of those early reigns, but their function. They mark an age qualitatively different from what follows. Whether interpreted symbolically, astronomically, or as memory distorted by time, they suggest a before that does not fit comfortably into later human categories. The Anunnaki appear within this framework not as originators, but as participants in a larger sequence, embedded within a story that was already old when it reached them. Even the gods' domains hint at this. Enlil governs wind and authority, Enki freshwater and wisdom, Inanna cycles of fertility and power. These are not inventions of a new order, but custodianships of forces that predate culture itself. The gods do not create the cosmos in Sumerian myth. They negotiate within it. They inherit constraints, rivalries, and laws that seem to bind even them. Fate, sacred decrees, circulate like artifacts from an earlier administration of reality, distributed rather than authored. Archaeology adds weight to this feeling of inheritance. Beneath the polished narratives of early cities lie traces of sudden transitions. The Ubaid culture, stretching back to the 6th millennium BCE, shows sophisticated pottery, planned settlements, and ritual continuity across vast distances. Its spread is remarkably uniform, suggesting not slow diffusion but shared templates. as if communities were restoring a known pattern rather than inventing a new. When Uruk culture later expands, it overlays rather than replaces, absorbing and amplifying what was already present. There are also absences that speak loudly. No clear evolutionary chain links simple village life directly to the administrative intensity of early Sumer. The leap appears compressed, as though intermediate steps were erased, forgotten, or never recorded. In the soil, transitions are sometimes abrupt. In the texts, explanations are rare. This combination creates a silence that invites reflection rather than assertion. Comparative mythology widens the frame. Flood narratives recur across Mesopotamia, but also beyond it, in forms that feel less like shared fiction and more like shared trauma. Geological research into post-glacial sea level rise shows that between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, coastlines shifted dramatically, swallowing plains and reshaping human habitats. In the Persian Gulf region, now submerged, some researchers have proposed the existence of fertile lands that could have supported early complex societies before rising waters erased them from view. These ideas remain debated, but they resonate uncannily with myths that speak of worlds lost beneath water, of wisdom preserved only in fragments. If such a society existed, its disappearance would not need to be total to leave an imprint. Knowledge could survive in rituals, symbols, spatial memory. Sacred sites might persist as anchors, rebuilt again and again, even as their original meanings faded. The Anunnaki in this light would not be creators ex nihilo, but figures through which inherited memory was reinterpreted, personified, made narratable again. This does not require extraterrestrial intervention, nor does it deny it. It simply loosens the timeline, allowing for depth where flatness has been assumed. The Sumerian texts themselves seem to invite this reading. They are not triumphalist, they are often melancholic, preoccupied with loss, decline, and the fragility of order. Even immortality, when it appears, is framed as something withheld, once possible, now distant. The Epic of Gilgamesh captures this tone precisely. Gilgamesh is not searching for new knowledge, but for something already lost. Utnapishtim, survivor of the flood, lives at the edge of the world, guarding a secret that cannot be reintegrated into ordinary life. The plant of rejuvenation is briefly recovered, then stolen, not by an enemy, but by a creature of the earth itself. Renewal slips away quietly, without drama, leaving only awareness. Read this way: the Anunnaki are not first. They are late enough to remember something slipping through their fingers. They preside over a world already diminished, tasked with maintaining a fragile continuity rather than inaugurating a golden age. Their stories feel less like declarations of power and more like attempts to stabilize meaning in the aftermath of disruption. And so the question that lingers at the edge of these texts is not who began civilization, but what ended the phase before it. What kind of order required gods to manage its remains? What kind of loss left humanity inheriting structures it could operate but no longer fully understand? The tablets do not answer. They wait patiently, as if aware that understanding comes not from certainty, but from staying with the unease they quietly preserve. The deeper one listens to the Sumerian texts, the more apparent it becomes that time itself behaves strangely within them. Chronology bends, stretches, and occasionally dissolves into something more symbolic than sequential. Events are not always placed in order, and causality feels implied rather than demonstrated. This is not the confusion of primitive record-keeping. It feels deliberate, as if the scribes were working with inherited fragments whose original temporal logic had already been damaged. One of the most revealing features is the way memory is embedded into ritual rather than narrative. Knowledge is preserved not through explanation, but through repetition. Hymns, temple instructions, and divine epithets repeat the same phrases across centuries with minimal variation. This consistency suggests that what mattered most was not understanding origins, but maintaining alignment with something already established. The past is treated less as a story and more as a condition that must be kept stable. In this context, the Anunnaki function less like innovators and more like administrators. Their authority is rarely absolute. They convene, argue, deliberate, and defer to decrees that appear older than any single god. The Me, often translated as divine laws or cosmic offices, are not created by the gods but distributed among them. These Mi govern everything from kingship to craftsmanship, from truth to deception. Their existence implies a system of order that predates the gods' active roles, a kind of operating structure inherited rather than authored. This sense of inherited authority mirrors what is seen in the earliest urban planning of Mesopotamia. Cities such as Uruk and Lagash were not chaotic accumulations of dwellings. They followed axial patterns, aligned to waterways, cardinal directions, and ritual sightlines. Such planning implies not spontaneous growth but adherence to templates. When similar layouts appear across distant sites, it raises the possibility that urban knowledge itself was transmitted as memory, not rediscovered independently. The ground beneath these cities reinforces this impression. Archaeological strata often reveal abrupt transitions between cultural phases. Tools, pottery styles, and building techniques sometimes change rapidly rather than gradually. In some cases, layers of occupation appear separated by periods of abandonment, as if populations withdrew and later returned to the same locations. When they returned, they did not start from nothing. They resumed, repaired, and reoccupied, as though responding to a familiar blueprint. Environmental studies complicate the picture further. Paleoclimate data from the Near East indicates repeated episodes of drought, flooding, and temperature fluctuation during the Holocene. These were not minor disturbances. Some would have disrupted agriculture on a regional scale, forcing migrations and social collapse. Yet the cultural memory of order persists across these disruptions. Ritual continuity outlasts environmental stability, suggesting that whatever was preserved mattered deeply enough to be carried through catastrophe. This persistence of memory without explanation creates an atmosphere of quiet aftermath. The Sumerian worldview does not celebrate progress. It mourns decline. Human life is short, laborious, and burdened. The gods themselves seem weary, managing scarcity rather than abundance. Creation myths focus not on bringing the world into existence, but on reorganizing labor, redistributing responsibility, and containing chaos that has already breached its boundaries. Even humanity's origin story reflects this tone. Humans are fashioned not as companions to the gods, but as workers. They are created to relieve divine fatigue, to take over tasks that had become unsustainable. This framing suggests a system under strain, not one at its beginning. Something about the previous order demanded more maintenance than the gods alone could provide. Humanity emerges as a corrective measure, not a celebration. What is striking is that this creation does not come with instruction manuals. Humans are inserted into a system that already exists, expected to function within it. Kingship descends from heaven fully formed. Temples are already standardized. Ritual calendars assume established celestial cycles. The Anunnaki oversee, but they do not teach from first principles. Knowledge is assumed to be latent, remembered, or intuited. This dynamic echoes in later Mesopotamian scholarship. Astronomical texts from Babylon show remarkable precision, tracking planetary cycles over centuries. Such accuracy requires long observational baselines. Yet the texts rarely describe how this knowledge was first acquired. They present results, not methods. The sky is treated as a ledger already in use, not a mystery newly opened. Linguistics offers another subtle clue. The Sumerian language appears in written form without clear ancestors. It is a language isolate, unrelated to Semitic tongues that later dominate the region. While spoken precursors may have existed, their absence in the record contributes to the sense of sudden appearance. Writing captures Sumerian already mature, capable of abstraction, metaphor, and administrative nuance. It arrives as if mid-sentence. This pattern of midstream arrival repeats across domains. Metallurgy, mathematics, and legal concepts surface with sophistication disproportionate to their archaeological precursors. Rather than a smooth curve of development, the evidence suggests pulses of consolidation following disruption. Civilization, in this light, becomes an act of recovery rather than invention. Seen through this lens, the Anunnaki occupy an ambiguous position. They are not the architects of the First Order, nor merely mythic embellishments. They are narrative anchors, figures through whom memory could be stabilized after loss. By embodying forces and offices, they allow a fractured past to be held together symbolically. Their stories give shape to what could no longer be fully recalled. This would explain the peculiar emotional tone of the texts. There is reverence, but also distance. The gods are powerful, yet constrained. They punish, but they also regret. They enforce order, but they do not seem confident it will last. Humanity's role is fragile, provisional, always one misstep away from another collapse. As centuries pass, this anxiety deepens rather than resolves. Later, Mesopotamian literature becomes increasingly preoccupied with omens, portents, and the interpretation of signs. Divination flourishes not as superstition, but as an attempt to read instability in advance. The universe is treated as a system that can fail again, and vigilance becomes a form of survival. All of this suggests that the Anunnaki were never meant to be first. They are custodians standing amid ruins too ancient to be named. Their authority rests not in creation, but in continuity under threat. The Sumerian texts do not celebrate them as founders. They present them as inheritors, burdened with maintaining coherence after an earlier order fractured. What remains unspoken is the nature of that fracture. The texts circle it, gesture toward floods, shifts in heaven and earth, sudden reconfigurations of fate. But they do not describe it directly. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps the memory was already too distant, too painful, or too destabilizing to articulate without unraveling what remained. Instead, the silence itself becomes the message. Civilization begins in these texts, not with triumph, but with the quiet work of remembering just enough to continue. Beneath the surface of the Sumerian narratives, there is a recurring sensation that knowledge does not originate where it is recorded. It arrives already shaped, already burdened with memory. This is especially evident in the way technical and sacred knowledge appears intertwined, as if the distinction between practical survival and cosmic understanding had once been unnecessary. The tablets do not celebrate discovery. They preserve procedures. Instructions are copied, not explained, as though their authority lies in faithful transmission rather than comprehension. Temple texts describe measurements, proportions, and orientations with a precision that feels inherited. The dimensions of sacred spaces align with astronomical cycles, seasonal rhythms, and hydraulic realities of the land. These are not arbitrary choices. They reflect an understanding of environment, sky, and time that exceeds what would be expected from a society only beginning to organize itself. The implication is subtle but persistent. Someone knew this before it was written down. This impression deepens when considering the mathematical structures embedded in Mesopotamian culture. The base 60 system, so foundational that it still shapes modern measurements of time and angle, appears without justification or origin story. It is used seamlessly, as if already familiar. Such a system is not intuitive. It requires abstraction, testing, and consensus. Yet the texts offer no hint of experimentation. They present a finished tool already integrated into daily life. The same pattern appears in legal traditions. Early law codes do not frame themselves as innovations. They are restorations of order. Even when kings claim divine inspiration, the tone is corrective rather than creative. Justice is portrayed as something that had drifted and now must be realigned. The laws do not invent morality, they recalibrate it. This suggests that ethical frameworks were perceived as older than any single ruler or dynasty. Within myth, this sense of inherited burden takes on emotional weight. The gods themselves are portrayed as bound by obligations they did not choose. They inherit domains, rivalries, and responsibilities that seem to predate their conscious agency. Conflicts among them often revolve around allocation rather than creation. Power is redistributed, not generated. Even rebellion among the gods feels less like revolution and more like tension within an aging system. The Anunnaki, in particular, are often depicted as a collective rather than as individual personalities. Their identity blurs at the edges, functioning almost as a council or category, rather than a pantheon of distinct characters. This collective quality reinforces the idea that they represent roles within a structure, not unique originators. They are placeholders for functions that needed guardians. Archaeological patterns echo this abstraction. Certain technological competencies appear widely distributed across early Mesopotamia with remarkable uniformity. Pottery kilns, irrigation canals, and standardized tools emerge across regions with minimal local variation. This suggests coordinated knowledge rather than isolated invention. When coordination appears before political centralization, it hints at a shared legacy rather than imposed control. Even art carries this undertone. Early iconography repeats motifs of symmetry, balance, and cyclical motion. Figures are arranged hierarchically, but not chaotically. There is restraint in representation, a focus on order over expression. This visual language communicates stability rather than experimentation, as though artists were reproducing a known grammar rather than inventing a new one. The land itself participates in this continuity. Mesopotamia's rivers are unpredictable, capable of both sustaining and destroying. Managing them requires collective memory. Knowledge of floods past, channels built, failures endured. Such memory is cumulative, passed down through generations. When texts describe divine oversight of water and fertility, they mirror human dependence on inherited environmental knowledge. The gods personify processes that humans already understand too well to take lightly. This convergence of myth, technology, and environment creates a haunting possibility. Civilization here may be less a forward march than a holding pattern. After an earlier disruption, perhaps severe enough to erase its own origins, society reorganized around preservation. The goal was not expansion, but survival of coherence. Writing, law, and ritual became tools to anchor memory against further loss. In this framework, the Anunnaki function as stabilizing symbols. They embody continuity in a world perceived as fragile. Their stories do not glorify novelty. They warn against imbalance. Punishment often follows excess, not ignorance. The greatest threat is not chaos from outside, but forgetting what keeps the system intact. Later reinterpretations of these myths increasingly emphasize control. As empires rise, gods become more authoritarian, more centralized. Yet traces of the older tone remain, a quiet anxiety beneath declarations of power. Even at their most confident, Mesopotamian rulers invoke restoration, not innovation. They rebuild temples, re-establish rituals, and renew covenants. Their legitimacy depends on alignment with something older than themselves. This pattern resonates with broader human experience after catastrophe. When systems collapse, what survives is not creativity, but fragments. Songs, measurements, rituals, and stories carry more than their surface meaning. They encode lessons learned at high cost. Over time, the reasons fade, but the forms persist. The Sumerian texts feel like this kind of inheritance, forms preserved after reasons were lost. There is a profound humility embedded in this worldview. Humans are not masters of fate. Even gods negotiate with forces beyond their control. Order is provisional, always at risk. This humility contrasts sharply with later narratives of progress and dominance. It suggests a civilization deeply aware of its vulnerability, shaped by memory of a previous failure it could not afford to repeat. The Anunnaki, then, are not pioneers standing at the dawn of time. They are figures standing amid the long shadow of something that ended. Their authority is derivative, their power conditional. They preside over maintenance, not genesis. Through them, the Sumerians articulate a relationship with the past that is reverent but unresolved. What lingers in the text is not a clear account of what came before, but an emotional residue. A sense that the present is thinner than it once was, that knowledge has narrowed, that something vast has receded beyond recall, leaving only outlines that can be traced but not filled. This residue shapes everything that follows. It informs the cautious tone of ritual, the fatalism of literature, the emphasis on balance and restraint. Civilization continues, but with the awareness that it is living on borrowed ground, sustained by memories it can no longer fully access. In this quiet acceptance, there is no proclamation of being first. There is only the effort to remain. As the Sumerian world unfolds further, attention drifts toward the subtle tension between memory and authority. Power in these texts is never absolute. It must be justified through alignment with something older and less visible. Kings do not rule because they are strong. They rule because they are positioned correctly within an inherited order. Their legitimacy depends on continuity, not conquest. Every inscription that praises a ruler also anchors him backward, tying his reign to divine sanction, ancient precedent, and forgotten beginnings. This backward orientation reveals itself most clearly in the language of restoration. Cities are not founded, they are renewed. Temples are not created, They are rebuilt according to original plans said to have descended from heaven. Even when devastation occurs, whether by flood, invasion, or famine, recovery is framed as return rather than progress. The future is imagined as a corrected past, not an uncharted horizon. Such framing suggests a civilization haunted by the awareness that deviation carries risk. Innovation, when it appears, is carefully cloaked as fidelity. New structures imitate old forms. New laws claim ancient origin. This is not mere conservatism. It reflects an underlying belief that the correct way of living was once known more fully than it is now, and that survival depends on approximating that lost balance. The Anunnaki, positioned within this worldview, act as intermediaries between visible authority and invisible order. They are invoked to validate decisions, to explain misfortune, to anchor human actions within a larger inherited framework. Yet they themselves are not portrayed as omnipotent creators. They respond to constraints, they negotiate outcomes. Their decrees often feel reactive, issued to stabilize situations already in motion. This reactive quality becomes especially apparent in stories of punishment and correction. Catastrophes are not random. They are responses to imbalance. Floods follow noise, famine follows neglect. Cities fall when rituals lapse. The universe behaves like a system that must be tuned, not dominated. The gods, including the Anunnaki, serve as regulators within that system rather than its source. Material evidence supports this conceptual structure. Across Mesopotamia, periods of prosperity alternate with abrupt collapse. Urban centers rise rapidly, reach complexity, then falter. Yet each collapse is followed by reoccupation. People return to the same riverbanks, the same mounds, the same foundations. They rebuild where ruins already stand, layering memory upon memory. This persistence suggests not ignorance of risk, but commitment to continuity. The tell, the artificial mound created by successive rebuilding, becomes a physical metaphor for civilization itself. Each layer represents both survival and loss. Earlier forms are buried but not erased. They shape what can be built above them. The present is always constrained by what lies beneath, visible only through careful excavation. In this way, the land itself mirrors the structure of the myths. Within these layers, certain symbols persist with remarkable endurance. The cosmic mountain, the sacred tree, the axis connecting heaven and earth appear again and again across centuries and regions. Their repetition suggests that they encode something essential, something remembered rather than invented. These symbols do not explain, they orient. They provide reference points within a world perceived as unstable. The same can be said of timekeeping. Calendars, festivals, and ritual cycles are synchronized with celestial movements that require long-term observation. The precision of these systems implies sustained attention across generations, yet the texts rarely describe the origin of this knowledge. Time is treated as something already mapped, something humans step into rather than chart themselves. This inherited temporality carries a quiet weight. Life is measured against cycles that exceed individual experience. Human achievement feels small when placed beside cosmic repetition. Even kings, with all their monuments, are fleeting participants in a rhythm that will continue without them. This perspective fosters humility, but also anxiety. Stability must be maintained precisely because it is not guaranteed. The Anunnaki embody this tension. They are powerful, yet bound. They oversee processes that cannot be stopped, only guided. Their myths often involve compromise, redistribution, and reluctant acceptance. When decisions are made, they are framed as necessary rather than triumphant. Authority appears burdened, not celebrated. As Mesopotamian history progresses, later cultures reinterpret these figures, emphasizing control and hierarchy. Yet the older undercurrent remains. Beneath declarations of dominance lies an awareness of fragility. The universe is not a machine that can be mastered. It is a system that remembers imbalance. This awareness extends into ethical thought. Human suffering is not always explained as punishment. Sometimes it is simply the cost of existence within a compromised order. Mortality itself feels like a reduction, a narrowing from an earlier state. Immortality exists, but it is remote, inaccessible, guarded at the margins of the world. humanity lives in the aftermath, managing what remains. Such a worldview does not lend itself to origin myths in the modern sense. There is no single moment of creation that resolves everything. Instead, there are sequences of adjustment following disruption. The Anunnaki preside over these adjustments, but they do not initiate the conditions that make them necessary. This distinction matters. It reframes the role of divine figures from architects to caretakers. It suggests that what truly shaped civilization occurred before the gods entered the narrative, in a time whose details have receded beyond recall. What survives is not a story of beginnings, but a system of responses. These responses are encoded in ritual, law, architecture, and myth, forming a web of continuity strong enough to persist through collapse. Yet their origin remains elusive. The Sumerians seem aware of this elusiveness. Their texts do not attempt to resolve it. They work around it, building meaning on what can still be accessed. In this light, the Anunnaki are neither deceivers nor saviors. They are symbols of a remembered obligation, to preserve balance in a world that has already demonstrated its capacity for loss. Their presence signals not the dawn of order, but the effort to prevent another ending. Civilization, as reflected here, is not confident in its permanence. It is cautious, layered, reflective. It moves forward while constantly looking back, measuring each step against traces of what once was. Progress is secondary to endurance. The deeper implication is unsettling in its quietness. If civilization began not with creation but with recovery, then the true beginning lies hidden beneath layers of adaptation. The Anunnaki stand not at the start but somewhere along the slope of descent, tasked with managing what could be salvaged. What remains is a civilization that knows it is living after something. The shape of that something is indistinct, but its absence is felt everywhere. In the careful preservation of ritual, in the reverence for ancient forms, in the reluctance to claim originality. This feeling does not demand explanation. It settles into the background, shaping behavior without revealing its source. Like a memory inherited without context, it guides choices while resisting articulation. And so the Sumerian world continues, balanced on accumulated layers, governed by figures who themselves look backward for authority. Civilization moves on, but always with the quiet knowledge that it is not standing at the beginning of time, only at another moment within a much longer unraveling. Over time, the Sumerian sense of inheritance becomes increasingly internalized. What once appears as external catastrophe gradually transforms into an internal condition, a quiet expectation that loss is woven into existence itself. This shift is subtle but profound. Early texts hint at rupture through floods and divine reorganization. Later reflections treat impermanence as the default state of the world. Civilization no longer waits for collapse to remind it of fragility. The reminder is constant, embedded in thought, ritual, and self-understanding. This internalization is most visible in the Sumerian conception of the human condition. Life is brief, laborious, and constrained by forces beyond comprehension. Suffering is not framed as exceptional, it is normal. Joy appears fleeting, almost suspicious. The afterlife offers no redemption, only a dim continuation. Such pessimism does not arise from ignorance or despair alone. It reads like the psychological residue of a deeper historical memory, one that taught survival at the cost of optimism. Within this atmosphere, the Anunnaki recede slightly from center stage. They remain present, invoked, and respected, but they no longer dominate every explanation. Instead, they become part of a larger impersonal structure. Fate gains prominence, decrees are fixed, outcomes feel sealed long before individual action. The gods administer, but they do not intervene endlessly. Their distance mirrors the distance of whatever original fullness has been lost. This distancing reshapes how knowledge itself is treated. Wisdom is not pursued aggressively. It is guarded, transmitted carefully, often restricted to specialized roles. Scribal schools emphasize memorization over innovation. Correct copying matters more than interpretation. Errors are dangerous not because they offend authority, but because they threaten continuity. Knowledge is a fragile inheritance, vulnerable to distortion if handled recklessly. The emotional tone of this system is not fear, but restraint. There is an awareness that certain thresholds should not be crossed. Excessive ambition attracts correction. Stories warn against overreaching, not because progress is evil, but because imbalance invites destabilization. The universe, as understood here, responds to pressure like a stressed structure. Push too hard, and collapse follows. This restraint echoes earlier patterns seen after large-scale disruption. Anthropological studies of post-catastrophe societies often note similar traits: reverence for tradition, suspicion of novelty, emphasis on ritual accuracy. These are not signs of stagnation but adaptive strategies. They preserve coherence when experimentation feels too risky. The Sumerian world carries these traits with remarkable consistency. Material culture reflects this cautious continuity. Tools evolve slowly. Artistic styles change incrementally. Even when new influences arrive, they are absorbed into existing frameworks rather than replacing them outright. The system prefers integration over rupture. This preference suggests collective memory of what rupture can cost. The Anunnaki, within this framework, serve as reminders rather than leaders. Their stories reinforce boundaries. They demonstrate consequences. When they argue or punish, it is usually to restore equilibrium. Their authority reinforces the idea that order must be maintained, not expanded recklessly. They are less aspirational figures than cautionary ones. This role becomes clearer when contrasted with later mythological systems that celebrate heroic transformation. In Mesopotamia, heroes rarely triumph completely. Even Gilgamesh, the most famous among them, fails at his deepest goal. He returns wiser but diminished. His journey does not change the structure of existence, it only clarifies his place within it. Such narratives do not inspire conquest of the unknown, they inspire acceptance of limits. This acceptance does not negate intelligence or curiosity, it channels them inward, toward understanding patterns rather than breaking them. Astronomy, mathematics, and divination flourish not as tools of domination, but as means of alignment. The goal is not to control the future, but to anticipate instability. Divination, in particular, reveals this mindset. Omens are read everywhere, in the sky, in animal behavior, in bodily signs. This omnipresent interpretation reflects a belief that the system constantly communicates its state. Nothing is random. Everything is symptomatic. Reading these signs becomes a way to remain synchronized with forces that cannot be altered directly. The prominence of divination suggests an environment where previous warning systems failed catastrophically. If an earlier civilization collapsed without adequate forewarning, the lesson would be clear. Vigilance is survival. The Anunnaki, associated with cosmic order, fit naturally into this vigilance framework. They represent the intelligibility of the system, even if its origins remain obscured. As centuries pass, this worldview becomes normalized. What may have begun as response to trauma settles into philosophy. The loss of origins is no longer felt as acute absence. It becomes the background condition of meaning itself. People live within inherited structures without expecting to recover what was lost. The question of beginnings fades, replaced by concern for maintenance. Yet traces of the older anxiety persist. Texts occasionally betray a deeper unease, moments where the thinness of the present becomes visible. Laments for destroyed cities speak not only of recent devastation, but of a recurring pattern. The language suggests familiarity with collapse, as if it has happened before in ways that exceed living memory. These laments do not accuse the gods of malice. They express sorrow at imbalance, resignation toward cycles that cannot be stopped, only endured. The tone is weary rather than angry. This weariness implies repetition. One does not grow weary from a single loss. In this emotional climate, the Anunnaki are no longer questioned as origins. Their position is accepted as part of the inherited order. The deeper question of what came before them remains unspoken, not because it is forbidden, but because it may no longer feel answerable. Silence becomes a form of respect toward what cannot be reconstructed. The result is a civilization that operates with extraordinary sophistication while carrying a subdued sense of incompleteness. Achievements are real, but provisional. Systems function, but feel temporary. There is pride, but it is restrained. The dominant mood is careful endurance rather than confident expansion. Seen this way, the Sumerian texts do not argue against the Anunnaki being first. They simply do not require them to be. Their role is defined by what they manage, not by what they begin. They preside over a world already shaped by absence, tasked with keeping it coherent despite that absence. This reframing shifts attention away from origins and toward consequences. The important question becomes not who started civilization, but how civilization learned to continue after something essential was lost. The Anunnaki are part of that learning process, woven into a narrative of adaptation rather than genesis. What survives in these texts is not a blueprint for creation, but a manual for persistence. It teaches how to live within limits, how to respect cycles, how to carry memory without being consumed by it. The cost of this wisdom is a certain heaviness, a recognition that fullness belongs to a time no longer accessible. Yet within that heaviness lies stability. The Sumerian world endures precisely because it does not expect to recover what was lost. It builds with what remains. It preserves forms even when meanings fade. It trusts continuity more than novelty. The Anunnaki, standing within this quiet endurance, are less like founders and more like witnesses. They mark the point at which memory becomes structure, where loss becomes law, and where civilization chooses survival over rediscovery. And so the story continues, not driven by revelation, but by careful repetition. What came before remains unnamed, but its shadow guides every step forward, shaping a civilization that knows, even without saying it, that it is living after something far older than its gods. As the Sumerian worldview matures, a subtle recalibration occurs in how absence is managed. What was once felt as loss becomes codified as structure. Memory, no longer capable of recalling origins, reorganizes itself into regulation. This transformation is not sudden. It unfolds quietly as rituals harden into schedules, myths into precedents, and divine actions into predictable patterns. Civilization begins to operate less like a living recollection, and more like a stabilized system designed to endure forgetting. This stabilization is visible in the increasing formalization of institutions. Temples expand into complex economic centers, managing land, labor, and redistribution. These are not merely religious spaces. They function as engines of continuity, preserving order through administration. The sacred and the practical become inseparable. Divine sanction legitimizes accounting. Ritual validates storage. In this fusion, the memory of disruption is kept at bay by relentless organization. The Anunnaki remain embedded within this system, but their presence becomes increasingly symbolic. Their stories are retold, standardized, and integrated into official doctrine. Variations narrow, ambiguities soften. What was once fluid memory crystallizes into accepted narrative. This process does not eliminate uncertainty, but it contains it, preventing it from destabilizing daily life. This containment has consequences. As myth becomes structure, imagination narrows. The unknown is no longer explored freely, it is managed. Divination, for instance, shifts from open interpretation to regulated practice. Specialists are trained, methods are standardized, omens are catalogued. The universe remains communicative, but its language is constrained within approved frameworks. Such regulation reflects a deep-seated fear of misalignment. If the system fails to interpret signs correctly, catastrophe may follow. The responsibility of interpretation becomes heavy. Knowledge is no longer simply inherited. It is guarded. Access is restricted. Errors carry weight. This environment fosters discipline, but also rigidity. Within this rigidity, the Anunnaki serve as guarantors of legitimacy. Their authority validates the system's constraints. By attributing order to divine precedent, society shields itself from the anxiety of invention. Nothing appears arbitrary. Every rule echoes an earlier mandate. Even when adaptations occur, they are framed as recoveries of original intent. This dynamic is particularly evident in the treatment of kingship. Rulers present themselves not as innovators, but as restorers. Their inscriptions emphasize piety, humility before the gods, and devotion to ancient ways. Authority flows downward from heaven, but heaven itself is bound by inherited law. The Anunnaki oversee this flow, ensuring that power remains tethered to continuity rather than ambition. The emotional texture of this world grows increasingly sober. Celebration exists, but it is restrained. Excess is discouraged. Balance becomes the highest value. The system rewards predictability. Stability is prized over brilliance. These priorities do not reflect a lack of creativity. They reflect a civilization that has learned the cost of instability. Material culture mirrors this inward turn. Monumental architecture becomes more standardized. Decorative motifs repeat familiar patterns. Innovation occurs within narrow bounds. This repetition reinforces collective identity. Each generation recognizes itself in the forms left by the previous one. Memory is no longer personal. It is architectural. The Anunnaki, once figures of narrative tension, now function as pillars within this architecture. They anchor meaning. Their names are invoked to bless transactions, to legitimize decisions, to sanctify space. Their presence is constant but subdued. They are less characters than constants. This constancy does not eliminate anxiety, it redirects it. Fear shifts from unknown origins to potential deviation. The greatest threat becomes misalignment with established order. Heresy, neglect, and disorder are framed as existential risks. The system survives by narrowing acceptable variation. This narrowing carries a paradox. While it preserves continuity, it also distances society from the deeper mystery that once animated its myths. The unknown is no longer contemplated openly. It is respected from afar. Silence replaces speculation. The past becomes sacred precisely because it cannot be fully accessed. In this silence, the Anunnaki recede further into abstraction. They become synonymous with order itself. Their individuality fades. Their collective authority strengthens. They are no longer remembered as participants in a story, but as embodiments of necessity. Their existence justifies structure without requiring explanation. This transformation reflects a broader human pattern. When origins are lost, systems replace stories. Rules replace memory. Ritual replaces recollection. Civilization stabilizes not by remembering everything, but by deciding what must not be forgotten. The rest is allowed to dissolve into myth. The Sumerian texts reveal this process with remarkable clarity. Early ambiguity gives way to later certainty, but the certainty is procedural rather than existential. People know how to act, not why the world is as it is. The Anunnaki preside over this knowing how, not knowing why. This distinction shapes ethical thought. Morality becomes situational, focused on maintaining balance rather than pursuing ideals. Good behavior aligns with order, evil disrupts it. These categories are practical, not metaphysical. They serve continuity rather than transcendence. Within this ethical framework, suffering is normalized. It is not seen as failure of the system, but as part of its operation. The gods do not eliminate pain, they regulate it. Excessive suffering signals imbalance. Ordinary suffering is expected. This expectation reduces shock, but deepens resignation. The Anunnaki's role in this worldview is subtle. They are invoked to explain boundaries, not to offer salvation. Their favor ensures stability, not happiness. Their displeasure signals misalignment, not moral condemnation. They are managers of equilibrium. As memory continues to recede, the possibility that the Anunnaki were not first becomes less threatening. Origins lose urgency. What matters is function. The system works. It endures. Whether the gods came after something else becomes secondary to their role in sustaining what remains. Yet the shadow of the earlier loss never fully disappears. It lingers in the carefulness of ritual, in the reluctance to innovate, in the reverence for ancient forms. Even as the system stabilizes, it carries a quiet awareness that stability was achieved after something irrevocable ended. This awareness does not erupt into rebellion or inquiry. It settles into acceptance. Civilization learns to live without knowing its own beginning. The Anunnaki, embedded within this acceptance, become part of the furniture of existence. They are no longer questioned. They are assumed. What began as memory of disruption becomes architecture of survival. The system holds. It functions. It persists. But beneath its ordered surface lies a depth that is no longer explored, only acknowledged through form. In this stage of the journey, the question of being first dissolves into irrelevance. The Anunnaki are present because they are necessary to the system as it exists. Their place is secured not by origin, but by endurance. Civilization continues, stabilized by repetition, governed by inherited structures and guided by figures who embody order rather than creation. The loss that once shaped everything is now silent, but its influence remains everywhere, shaping a world that moves forward carefully, carrying the weight of a past it no longer attempts to name. With the passing of generations, the distance between lived experience and inherited structure widens. What was once remembered as consequence becomes accepted as nature. The Sumerian world settles into a rhythm where order feels given, not chosen. People are born into systems whose origins are no longer debated, only enacted. The deeper past fades into an ambient presence, shaping behavior without demanding attention. This settling produces a peculiar calm. Anxiety does not disappear, but it becomes diffuse. It no longer fixates on singular catastrophes. Instead, it permeates everyday life as a low awareness that balance must be maintained continuously. The rituals that structure time, the offerings that punctuate seasons, and the laws that regulate exchange all work together to keep the system aligned. Stability is not celebrated loudly. It is preserved quietly. Within this environment, knowledge transforms again. What had been guarded becomes specialized. Scribes, priests, and diviners form closed circuits of transmission. Each group maintains a particular fragment of the whole, ensuring that no single perspective dominates. This fragmentation reduces risk. If one lineage of knowledge fails, others persist. Redundancy becomes resilience. The Anunnaki occupy a crucial place in this fragmented coherence. Their collective nature allows them to function as connective tissue across domains. They are invoked in agriculture and law, in astronomy and healing, in kingship and craftsmanship. Their names link disparate practices into a shared cosmology. Through them, the system maintains unity without centralization. This unity is conceptual rather than emotional. The gods inspire respect, not intimacy. Prayer is formal. Supplication follows prescribed language. Innovation in devotion is rare. This formality reflects trust in procedure over spontaneity. Correct action matters more than inner transformation. The goal is alignment, not transcendence. Such a worldview shapes how history is recorded. Chronicles emphasize continuity. Breaks are minimized. When disruptions occur, they are framed as temporary deviations rather than fundamental resets. Even conquest is narrated as restoration of proper order. This narrative strategy reduces existential threat. It allows society to absorb change without re-examining foundations. Archaeological evidence aligns with this narrative containment. Cultural transitions are often smoothed over in material record. New rulers adopt old symbols. New languages borrow old terms. Change wears familiar clothing. This practice preserves identity while allowing adaptation. The system bends without breaking. In this context, the question of primacy becomes increasingly irrelevant. Whether the Anunnaki came first or inherited their roles matters less than the fact that they continue to function. Their legitimacy derives from effectiveness. They keep the system intelligible. They provide reference points in a world that might otherwise feel arbitrary. The emotional consequence of this pragmatism is a muted sense of wonder. Mystery remains, but it is distanced. The unknown is acknowledged respectfully, not explored recklessly. Curiosity is tempered by caution. This balance prevents destabilization, but also limits imaginative expansion. The system survives by narrowing the range of acceptable thought. Yet even within this narrowing, subtle tensions persist. Laments, hymns, and personal prayers occasionally reveal longing for something beyond maintenance. These expressions do not articulate clear desires. They hint at a felt absence, a sense that life once held greater fullness. The language is vague, careful not to disrupt order. Longing is allowed only as atmosphere. The Anunnaki absorb this longing without resolving it. Their presence legitimizes acceptance. They stand as proof that order exists even if meaning feels thin. They anchor faith in structure rather than narrative fulfillment. In doing so, they help transform loss into endurance. This transformation has consequences for how future generations interpret the past. As the memory of rupture recedes, the system's survival begins to look like inevitability. What was once adaptive becomes normative. People no longer see their way of life as response to catastrophe. They see it as the natural state of the world. This normalization obscures the original loss further. The deeper past becomes inaccessible not through suppression, but through irrelevance. Without emotional urgency, there is no reason to excavate it. The Anunnaki, integrated into everyday logic, no longer point backward. They point inward, reinforcing present order. Later cultures that inherit Mesopotamian traditions will reinterpret these gods in new contexts. Names change, attributes shift, but the underlying function persists. Divine figures continue to legitimize systems that prioritize continuity over origin stories. The Anunnaki's legacy extends not through mythic detail, but through structural influence. This legacy reveals something fundamental about civilization under constraint. When origins are uncertain and future stability is fragile, societies gravitate toward frameworks that minimize existential risk. They privilege repetition, formalism, and symbolic authority. They accept limits. They learn to live within inherited boundaries. The Sumerian example demonstrates this process in early clarity. It shows how a culture can achieve remarkable sophistication while carrying a subdued awareness of incompleteness. It shows how gods can function as stabilizers rather than creators. It shows how memory can be preserved through form long after content fades. The Anunnaki's role within this system becomes almost architectural. They are load-bearing elements. Remove them, and coherence weakens. Question them, and uncertainty spreads. Their authority is not charismatic, it is structural. They hold the system together by embodying necessity. This necessity does not require belief in beginnings. It requires belief in alignment. As long as actions correspond to established patterns, the system endures. The past remains silent. The future remains manageable. The present remains ordered. Yet beneath this order lies a quiet fragility. The system depends on constant maintenance. Rituals must be performed. Laws must be enforced. Knowledge must be copied accurately. Any lapse risks misalignment. Stability is labor-intensive. It demands vigilance. This demand shapes character. It produces careful people. It discourages extremes. It rewards reliability. Over time, these traits become virtues. The civilization defines goodness in terms of balance and restraint. Excess becomes suspect. Innovation becomes risky. The Anunnaki reflect and reinforce these virtues. Their stories emphasize consequences rather than heroics. Their interventions restore balance rather than create novelty. They model the values the system requires to survive. As the journey continues, the civilization's focus shifts further from what once was to what must be maintained. The question of being first dissolves entirely. What matters is being correct. Correct in ritual, correct in measurement, correct in timing. This correctness is not oppressive. It is protective. It shelters society from the anxiety of groundlessness. It provides a sense of orientation in a world whose deeper foundations are no longer visible. In this stage, the Anunnaki are fully absorbed into the logic of endurance. They are no longer symbols of mystery. They are instruments of continuity. Their presence reassures by repetition, not revelation. Civilization moves forward under their quiet governance, not toward discovery, but toward sustained equilibrium. The deeper past remains buried beneath layers of practice. Its absence is no longer felt sharply. It has become part of the background hum of existence. What began as a response to loss has become a way of life. The system functions. It persists. It adapts carefully. And within it, the Anunnaki stand not as ancestors or pioneers, but as fixtures in a world that has learned to survive without knowing its own beginning. As the Sumerian system reaches a mature equilibrium, the notion of time itself undergoes a subtle transformation. Time is no longer perceived primarily as a line stretching from an origin toward an outcome. It becomes cyclical, layered, recursive. Festivals repeat. Omens recur. Astronomical patterns loop with dependable precision. Within this temporal architecture, beginnings lose urgency. What matters is recurrence, the assurance that patterns return if properly maintained. This cyclical awareness softens the emotional impact of uncertainty. When events repeat, they feel less threatening. Floods, droughts, and political upheavals become variations within a known rhythm, rather than singular catastrophes. The Anunnaki, embedded within this rhythm, function as markers of continuity. Their authority aligns with cycles rather than moments. They belong to repetition, not rupture. This alignment is visible in the way sacred narratives are performed rather than explained. Myths are enacted through ritual, not dissected for meaning. Performance reinforces familiarity. Each retelling confirms that the world still operates within recognizable bounds. Meaning is absorbed through participation, not analysis. This method preserves coherence without requiring comprehension of origins. The shift toward performance reflects a broader strategy of containment. By embedding knowledge in action, society reduces the risk of reinterpretation. What is done correctly matters more than why it is done. The Anunnaki preside over these actions as witnesses rather than teachers. Their presence sanctifies repetition, ensuring that each cycle remains aligned with inherited order. Language itself adapts to this function. Liturgical phrases fossilize. Their meanings may drift, but their sounds remain stable. Repetition becomes a form of memory independent of understanding. In this way, civilization remembers without recalling. The past is present through form, not narrative. This phenomenon extends to architecture. Temples are rebuilt according to ancient plans, even when their original rationale is no longer clear. Proportions are preserved, orientations are maintained. Builders follow inherited measurements with devotion. The resulting spaces feel timeless, anchoring communities in a continuity that transcends individual lifespans. The Anunnaki inhabit these spaces conceptually. Their domains correspond to functions enacted within temple life. Water management, grain storage, legal arbitration, and calendrical regulation all fall under divine oversight. The gods are not distant abstractions. They are integrated into daily operations. Their relevance is practical, not speculative. This practicality further diminishes interest in origins. A system that works does not invite inquiry into its beginnings. Stability discourages excavation. Curiosity gives way to trust in procedure. The deeper past becomes a non-issue not through denial, but through sufficiency. Yet beneath this sufficiency lies a subtle compression of meaning. When repetition replaces inquiry, symbolic richness narrows. Myths lose elasticity. They no longer adapt to new contexts easily. Their function becomes preservation rather than exploration. The Anunnaki, once flexible figures capable of embodying tension, solidify into fixed references. This solidification has psychological consequences. Individuals experience belonging through conformity rather than insight. Identity is shaped by role rather than aspiration. Fulfillment comes from alignment with established patterns. Deviance carries risk, not just socially, but cosmically. The system communicates that harmony depends on adherence. Despite this rigidity, creativity does not vanish, it is redirected. Innovation occurs within sanctioned frameworks. New hymns follow old meters, new rituals echo ancient gestures. Change is incremental, carefully masked as continuity. The civilization adapts by camouflage rather than declaration. The Anunnaki facilitate this camouflage. Their collective nature allows reinterpretation without overt change. Attributes shift subtly, emphases adjust, new functions are absorbed quietly. The gods remain the same, even as their roles evolve. This flexibility within sameness enables survival. As external pressures mount through climate fluctuation and regional conflict, this adaptive conservatism proves effective. The system absorbs shocks by tightening ritual precision. In times of uncertainty, adherence intensifies. People lean harder into established patterns. The past, though inaccessible, becomes a stabilizing weight. This dynamic reinforces a worldview in which the universe is fundamentally ordered, even if opaque. Chaos exists, but it is bounded. It emerges when alignment fails and recedes when order is restored. The Anunnaki embody this principle. They are guarantors that order persists beyond human understanding. Such a worldview does not encourage radical speculation. It encourages maintenance of trust. Faith is placed not in revelation, but in continuity. The deepest assurance comes from repetition itself. Each successful cycle confirms that the system still holds. Over generations, this assurance becomes habitual. People no longer consciously perceive it. It fades into the background of existence. Rituals are performed because they are performed. Gods are honored because they are honored. Meaning is implicit, not articulated. This habituation further distances society from its deeper past. Without conscious engagement, memory atrophies. The origins of forms dissolve. What remains are gestures without stories. The Anunnaki preside over these gestures as silent witnesses, their original narrative functions largely forgotten. Yet even in this forgetting, traces remain. Certain moments, such as eclipses or unexpected disasters, briefly disrupt complacency. In these moments, anxiety surfaces. The system responds by intensifying ritual, consulting omens, reaffirming alignment. These responses suggest an underlying awareness that stability is conditional. The Anunnaki's authority becomes most visible in such moments. Their names are invoked with urgency, their favour is sought, their displeasure is feared. They are called upon not to explain events, but to restore equilibrium. Their role is therapeutic rather than explanatory. This therapeutic function reveals the final stage of their integration. The gods become part of the emotional regulation of society. They help manage fear, uncertainty, and grief. They provide a framework within which distress can be processed without destabilizing the system. In this role, the Anunnaki are indispensable. They absorb anxiety that might otherwise fracture coherence. They translate uncertainty into manageable ritual response. Their presence reassures without revealing. At this point in the journey, the question of precedence has lost all traction. The civilization operates effectively without knowing who or what came first. The system has learned to function on an inherited momentum alone. The Anunnaki are components of that momentum, not its origin. The deeper past remains buried beneath layers of repetition, performance, and form. Its absence is no longer felt as loss. It has been metabolized into structure. Civilization stands not on memory, but on habit. This transformation completes a long arc. What began as response to disruption becomes a self-sustaining order. The Anunnaki, once carriers of memory, now serve as anchors of routine. They hold the system steady by embodying continuity itself. In this steady state, the world feels complete enough. It does not seek beginnings. It seeks balance. It does not ask where it came from. It focuses on remaining aligned. The journey continues within this alignment, carried forward by cycles that repeat reliably. The past remains silent. The present remains structured, and the Anunnaki remain, not as first beings, but as enduring fixtures within a civilization that has learned to survive by repetition rather than remembrance. As repetition hardens into habit, the Sumerian world begins to reveal an unexpected tension beneath its calm surface. Stability, once a response to disruption, slowly acquires a cost of its own. The same mechanisms that preserve order also constrain perception. What is gained in endurance is balanced by a narrowing of imagination. The civilization remains coherent, but it becomes increasingly inward-looking, oriented toward preservation rather than expansion of understanding. This inward turn subtly reshapes how reality itself is interpreted. Events are no longer approached as opportunities for insight, but as confirmations of existing patterns. An omen does not open new possibilities. It reaffirms what is already known. A ritual does not transform meaning. It sustains alignment. Experience becomes cyclical in both structure and interpretation. The world speaks, but only within a familiar vocabulary. Within this closed semantic loop, the Anunnaki assume a more abstract role. Their stories are less frequently retold in full. Instead, their names function as references, shorthand for entire domains of order. Invoking them activates a network of associations without requiring narrative elaboration. The gods become symbols of functions rather than actors in unfolding drama. This abstraction has the effect of flattening mythic depth. Characters lose complexity. Conflicts become archetypal rather than situational. What once carried emotional ambiguity settles into symbolic certainty. The Anunnaki no longer struggle. They stabilize. Their presence reinforces predictability, which is both comforting and limiting. Such predictability influences social organization. Roles become more fixed. Occupational identities solidify. Mobility diminishes. People know their place, and that knowledge provides security. Yet it also reduces the incentive to question inherited structures. Ambition is redirected toward mastery within existing roles rather than transformation of the system itself. The educational process reflects this orientation. Learning emphasizes accuracy over curiosity. Students copy texts repeatedly, internalizing forms without exploring alternatives. Success is measured by fidelity, not insight. This approach ensures continuity but discourages deviation. The system perpetuates itself efficiently. The Anunnaki's authority underwrites this educational philosophy. Because knowledge is seen as divinely sanctioned, altering it carries risk. Preservation becomes a moral duty. Innovation is permitted only when framed as recovery of something ancient rather than introduction of something new. Over time, this framing becomes habitual. Even genuine innovations are retroactively attributed to earlier origins. Discoveries are presented as rediscoveries. Change is disguised as remembrance. The deeper past, though inaccessible, is invoked to legitimize adaptation without unsettling continuity. This dynamic reinforces the impression that the Anunnaki stand at the boundary between visible order and invisible precedent. They authorize continuity by embodying inherited legitimacy. Their power lies not in creation, but in validation. They confirm that what exists is aligned with what once was, even if what once was can no longer be described. The psychological effect of this arrangement is complex. On one hand, it provides reassurance. Life unfolds within known parameters. The world feels intelligible. On the other hand, it fosters a quiet sense of confinement. Possibility narrows. The horizon of imagination contracts. The unknown becomes something to manage rather than explore. Literary expressions from later Mesopotamian periods hint at this tension. Characters express weariness, longing, and resignation. The tone is reflective, not triumphant. Wisdom literature emphasizes acceptance over aspiration. Happiness is rare and fleeting. The highest virtue is endurance. The Anunnaki's presence in such literature is subdued. They are rarely portrayed as sources of joy. Instead, they are invoked in contexts of obligation, fate, and consequence. Their favor maintains stability. Their absence threatens disorder. They are guardians of limits. This guardianship extends to cosmology. The universe is depicted as a layered structure with defined boundaries. Heaven, earth, and underworld each have their place. Movement between them is restricted. Transgression carries consequence. This cosmology mirrors social organization. Everything has a place. Movement is regulated. The deeper implication of this regulated cosmos is that beginnings are inaccessible by design. The system does not encourage return to origins. It encourages adherence to current alignment. The Anunnaki, positioned within this structure, do not point backward. They anchor the present. As external influences enter Mesopotamia through trade and contact, this anchoring function becomes more pronounced. New ideas are absorbed selectively, filtered through existing frameworks. Foreign deities are syncretized with familiar ones. The Anunnaki's domains expand without disrupting coherence. This adaptability preserves stability while masking transformation. Such masking is effective. The civilization evolves while appearing unchanged. The deeper past recedes further as layers accumulate. Each generation inherits a system more complete and less questioned than the last. The question of who came first becomes irrelevant within daily life. Yet beneath this surface irrelevance lies a subtle fragility. The system's strength depends on its closedness. It functions well as long as assumptions remain unchallenged. A significant disruption, one that cannot be integrated through existing rituals, would strain its coherence. The memory of such disruption may be distant, but its possibility is implicit. This implicit awareness manifests as caution. The civilization invests heavily in divination, omen interpretation, and ritual precision. These practices serve as early warning systems, attempting to detect misalignment before it escalates. The Anunnaki, associated with cosmic order, legitimize this vigilance. The gods' authority thus shifts fully into maintenance mode. They are no longer part of an unfolding story. They are constants against which variation is measured. Their stories, once carriers of memory, become templates for interpretation. At this stage, the Anunnaki's position as non-originators is effectively sealed. Their function has no need of primacy. They exist to sustain a system that has learned to operate without asking where it began. Their presence is justified by utility, not by ancestry. The deeper past, if it ever held a different order, remains buried beneath ritual repetition. Its traces are faint, encoded only in the system's caution and restraint. The civilization does not seek to recover it. It seeks to avoid repeating its loss. This orientation toward avoidance rather than discovery shapes the final tone of the Sumerian worldview. Life is managed carefully. Meaning is stabilized. Mystery is acknowledged but held at a distance. The Anunnaki preside over this careful balance, embodying the principle that survival depends on knowing one's limits. In this quiet equilibrium, the world feels complete enough to endure. It does not hunger for origins. It does not strive for transcendence. It moves within a narrow corridor of stability, guided by inherited structures and guarded by gods who exist not to explain beginnings, but to ensure continuation. The journey carries on within this corridor, steady and contained. The Anunnaki remain present as silent custodians, their origins unexamined, their authority unquestioned, holding a civilization in place as it moves forward without looking back. By the time Mesopotamian civilization reaches its later phases, the architecture of endurance has become so complete that it begins to obscure its own foundations. What once functioned as a response to loss now presents itself as an unquestioned reality. Order feels intrinsic to the world rather than constructed. The structures that preserved memory now replace it entirely. Civilization no longer remembers adapting, it only remembers existing. This shift produces a distinctive atmosphere of inevitability. Social hierarchies, ritual obligations, and cosmic boundaries appear fixed. People move through life as participants in a system that seems older than history itself. Even when change occurs, it is absorbed seamlessly, interpreted as confirmation rather than deviation. The system appears to regenerate itself, reinforcing the illusion of permanence. Within this illusion, the Anunnaki become fully embedded as conceptual infrastructure. They are no longer perceived as beings who entered history at a particular moment. They exist outside time, or rather, time exists through them. Their presence is assumed wherever order is observed. Grain grows according to cycle. Kings rule by mandate. Seasons return reliably. The gods are felt in function, not story. This functional divinity reshapes spiritual experience. Devotion becomes procedural. Offerings are given because they maintain balance, not because they inspire transformation. Piety is measured by correctness. The emotional intensity of belief diminishes, replaced by consistency. Faith becomes maintenance of alignment rather than engagement with mystery. The psychological comfort of this arrangement is significant. A predictable cosmos reduces existential anxiety. When every outcome can be interpreted within an established framework, uncertainty loses its edge. Even disaster can be contextualized as misalignment rather than randomness. Suffering acquires explanation without resolution, which is often enough to endure it. Yet this comfort carries an invisible cost. When explanation replaces inquiry, depth recedes. The unknown becomes a category rather than a frontier. People know that something lies beyond comprehension, but they do not approach it. They respect it by keeping distance. The Anunnaki serve as buffers, standing between human experience and whatever deeper reality once existed. This buffering effect shapes how history itself is remembered. Records become increasingly formulaic. Events are logged, dated, categorized. Narrative richness declines. The emotional texture of memory thins. What remains is chronology without context, fact without meaning. History becomes a ledger of continuity rather than a story of becoming. The Anunnaki's names persist in these records, but their narrative vitality fades. They are invoked as constants, not explored as personalities. Their presence signals legitimacy, not imagination. The gods become references rather than revelations. This transformation aligns with a broader evolution of writing itself. Early texts carried ambiguity, metaphor, and layered meaning. Later administrative records prioritize clarity and control. Writing becomes an instrument of governance rather than reflection. It preserves order efficiently while sacrificing nuance. As this process continues, the civilization's relationship with its own past grows increasingly abstract. The deeper layers beneath the tell are physically present but mentally inaccessible. People walk atop accumulated history without engaging it. The ground holds memory that the mind no longer seeks to access. In such a context, the idea that the Anunnaki were not first loses all disruptive power. The system does not require firstness to function. It requires continuity. The gods provide that continuity by embodying order itself. Their authority is circular. They are legitimate because the system works, and the system works because they are legitimate. This circularity is stable, but closed. It resists intrusion from outside perspectives. When confronted with foreign ideas that challenge foundational assumptions, the system responds by reinterpretation rather than confrontation. New concepts are translated into familiar terms. Differences are neutralized through equivalence. The Anunnaki facilitate this neutralization. Their flexible domains allow assimilation without upheaval. They absorb foreign attributes, expanding their symbolic range while preserving core function. In doing so, they protect the system from fragmentation. Over time, this protective function becomes their primary significance. The gods are no longer bearers of ancient memory. They are guardians of systemic integrity. Their worship maintains cohesion. Their myths reinforce boundaries. Their authority stabilizes identity. This stabilization extends into moral thought. Ethics become situational and conservative. Right action aligns with order. Wrong action disrupts it. Moral complexity is reduced. Ambiguity is minimized. The goal is not moral excellence but social equilibrium. Such an ethical system discourages radical critique. Dissent threatens alignment. Questioning foundational structures risks destabilization. As a result, critical inquiry retreats to the margins. Wisdom becomes synonymous with acceptance. The Anunnaki in this environment symbolize the wisdom of limits. They embody the understanding that survival depends on restraint. Their authority discourages excess and ambition. Their presence affirms that the world is finite and must be managed carefully. This affirmation shapes the emotional tone of the civilization's later expressions. Literature grows introspective, often melancholic. Hope is muted. Achievement is tempered by awareness of impermanence. The dominant mood is sober continuity rather than aspiration. Yet within this sobriety lies resilience. The civilization endures precisely because it does not overreach. It adapts quietly. It integrates change without breaking form. It survives through repetition and discipline. The Anunnaki's final role within this endurance is subtle but decisive. They represent the point at which memory becomes system, where loss becomes law, and where history transforms into habit. They are not remembered as beings who initiated civilization, but as figures who made it possible to continue. In this sense, their non-firstness is not a deficiency. It is a defining feature. They belong to the aftermath, not the origin. Their authority arises from managing what remains rather than creating what was lost. The deeper past, whatever it contained, remains unreachable. It is buried beneath layers of adaptation and survival. The civilization does not attempt to retrieve it. It builds above it, trusting that stability is enough. This trust sustains the world for generations. Life continues within ordered cycles. Rituals repeat. Records accumulate. The system holds. And within this holding, the Anunnaki remain, silent and essential, not as founders at the beginning of time, but as enduring supports within a civilization that has learned to live without knowing its own first moment. As centuries accumulate and empires rise and recede across Mesopotamia, the inherited system begins to show subtle signs of strain, not collapse, but fatigue. The structures that once stabilized memory now demand constant reinforcement. Ritual precision increases. Legal codes expand. Omens multiply. The machinery of order grows heavier, requiring more effort to sustain the same equilibrium. Endurance itself becomes labor. This weight alters how meaning is experienced. Where earlier generations accepted restraint as protection, later ones begin to feel its pressure. The system still functions, but it feels less organic, more mechanical. Alignment is maintained through vigilance rather than intuition. Correctness replaces confidence. The world remains intelligible, yet increasingly rigid. Within this rigidity, the Anunnaki's presence takes on a quieter, more distant quality. They are still invoked, still foundational, but their immediacy fades. Their names circulate through formula and inscription rather than lived narrative. Divine authority persists, yet it feels abstracted, mediated through institutions rather than encountered directly. This abstraction reflects a broader shift in spiritual psychology. The sense of participation in cosmic order weakens. Rituals are performed accurately, but with diminished emotional resonance. Faith becomes procedural. Devotion becomes obligation. The gods guarantee order, but they no longer animate it. Such conditions foster a subtle nostalgia, though it is rarely articulated clearly. Texts begin to look backward more deliberately, idealizing earlier times as purer, closer to divine intent. Ancient kings are praised not merely for power, but for proximity to origins. Antiquity itself acquires moral weight. The past becomes a standard against which the present feels diminished. This reverence for antiquity intensifies the paradox at the heart of the system. The deeper the civilization moves forward, the more it venerates what lies behind, even as that past remains inaccessible. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this paradox. They are symbols of ancient legitimacy, yet they cannot restore what is long gone. They authorize continuity without renewal. The increasing prominence of law illustrates this tension. Legal systems grow more detailed, addressing ever finer distinctions. This expansion aims to prevent disorder, yet it also signals anxiety. When balance must be specified explicitly, it suggests that intuitive alignment has weakened. Law becomes a substitute for lost coherence. The Anunnaki, associated with justice and cosmic order, lend authority to this legal expansion. Their sanction legitimizes complexity. Yet their role shifts from guiding equilibrium to enforcing compliance. Order becomes something imposed rather than felt. This change affects how individuals relate to the system. Obedience replaces participation. People follow rules not because they embody harmony, but because deviation carries consequence. The system still claims sacred origin, but its lived experience grows increasingly secular in tone, focused on regulation rather than reverence. In literature, this shift manifests as a deepening sense of weariness. Texts reflect on the burdens of life, the inevitability of decline, the futility of seeking lasting fulfillment. Wisdom becomes acceptance of limits, rather than alignment with purpose. The Anunnaki remain present as arbiters of fate, but their presence offers no consolation. This weariness does not produce rebellion. It produces resignation. The system is too encompassing to be overturned, too necessary to abandon. Individuals adapt internally, adjusting expectations rather than structures. Meaning contracts inward, becoming personal rather than cosmic. The gods, including the Anunnaki, accommodate this contraction by becoming more distant. Their silence mirrors human withdrawal from existential inquiry. They preside over outcomes without engaging inner life. Their authority is external, not transformative. At this stage, the civilization's relationship with its own origins becomes almost entirely symbolic. The idea that something came before the gods persists only as atmosphere, not as explicit memory. It is sensed through melancholy, through caution, through the reverence for ancient forms. The Anunnaki no longer point toward that earlier time. They shield the present from its implications. This shielding is necessary for stability. To confront the full depth of loss might destabilize the system beyond repair. The civilization chooses endurance over excavation. The gods support this choice by embodying continuity without explanation. As political power shifts among empires, the system's adaptability is tested. New rulers adopt old frameworks, invoking ancient gods to legitimize new authority. The Anunnaki's names endure across linguistic and cultural transitions, demonstrating their function as carriers of structural legitimacy rather than specific mythic identity. This endurance confirms their role as non-originators. They are not tied to a single beginning. They float above beginnings, attaching themselves to any system that requires validation. Their authority is transferable, which makes it resilient. Yet this resilience further distances them from lived meaning. They become instruments of governance rather than sources of insight. Their presence stabilizes power, but it does not inspire transformation. They hold the world together, but they do not renew it. The civilization accepts this trade-off. Renewal is risky. Stability is safer. The memory of earlier loss, though faint, continues to guide this preference. Better to endure within known limits than to reach toward uncertain depth. In this acceptance, the system achieves remarkable longevity. It survives invasions, climate stress, political upheaval. Its forms persist even as populations change. The Anunnaki remain recognizable through it all, their authority intact. Yet beneath this endurance lies a quiet hollowing. The structures remain, but their inner resonance thins. The system works, but it feels heavy. Meaning is preserved, but compressed. This compression marks a turning point. Civilization reaches a stage where its greatest strength, its capacity for continuity, also becomes its greatest constraint. The Anunnaki, embodying that continuity, stand at the center of this tension. They are no longer symbols of memory or mystery. They are symbols of necessity. Their authority no longer invites reflection. It demands maintenance. At this point, the journey has carried civilization far from any possible beginning. The question of who came first has dissolved completely. What remains is the task of keeping order intact long enough to endure another generation. The Anunnaki fulfill that task faithfully. They do not promise renewal, they ensure survival. And so the world continues, steady but tired, held together by structures that remember how to endure even as they forget why they were first built. As endurance stretches across centuries, the system's relationship with silence deepens. What was once an absence felt at the edges of memory becomes an accepted void at the center of meaning. The civilization no longer attempts to fill this void. It organizes itself around it. Silence becomes structural, shaping how knowledge, authority, and belief are arranged without ever being named. This structural silence alters the texture of spiritual life. The gods are still honored, rituals still performed, but expectation diminishes. Prayer is no longer oriented toward transformation or revelation. It is oriented toward preservation. Words are offered carefully, not to invite change, but to avoid disruption. Speech itself becomes cautious, shaped by the awareness that too much articulation can destabilize what holds. The Anunnaki exist comfortably within this silence. Their authority does not depend on explanation. It depends on continuity. They are present without speaking, invoked without being described. Their power lies in what they do not reveal. In this way, they mirror the civilization's own strategy of survival, to endure by withholding. This withholding reshapes intellectual life. Scholarship continues, but its focus narrows. Commentaries elaborate on established texts rather than generating new frameworks. Interpretation circles within accepted boundaries. Knowledge grows denser, not wider. Each generation adds layers of explanation without altering foundations. Such density creates an illusion of depth. Texts multiply. Archives expand. Yet the core questions remain untouched. The system grows more complex while remaining conceptually closed. The Anunnaki sanction this closure by standing as ultimate references beyond which inquiry does not pass. This closure is not enforced violently. It is internalized. People learn intuitively where not to look. Curiosity is guided away from destabilizing directions. Wonder survives, but it is domesticated. It appears in awe of order rather than inquiry into origin. The emotional consequence of this domestication is subtle detachment. Individuals participate fully in ritual and law, yet their inner lives withdraw slightly. Meaning becomes something external, located in correct action rather than inner resonance. Fulfillment is measured by alignment, not by insight. The Anunnaki's role in this externalization is crucial. They anchor meaning outside the individual. By embodying order as something given, they relieve individuals of the burden of existential interpretation. Life becomes manageable, if not deeply fulfilling. This manageability supports social cohesion. People know what is expected. The world feels stable enough to endure. Yet beneath this stability lies a quiet narrowing of experience. The range of emotional expression contracts. Grief is ritualized. Joy is moderated. Excess emotion risks imbalance. Literary expressions from this period reflect this modulation. Texts favor restraint. They value wisdom defined as knowing one's limits. Characters who seek too much are corrected, not celebrated. The narrative arc bends toward acceptance rather than transformation. The Anunnaki appear in these narratives as regulators rather than participants. They enforce boundaries. They restore balance. Their interventions are corrective, not creative. They maintain the system's equilibrium without offering new horizons. As political realities shift and new powers absorb Mesopotamian traditions, this regulated worldview proves adaptable. It travels well because it prioritizes structure over story. New rulers adopt the gods as guarantors of order. The Anunnaki's names persist even as languages change. Their function remains intact. This persistence further abstracts their identity. They become less tied to specific myths and more associated with generalized authority. Their individuality dissolves into institutional presence. They are everywhere and nowhere, invoked constantly yet rarely contemplated. Such abstraction makes them resilient. They can survive reinterpretation because their essence is functional rather than narrative. They legitimize systems regardless of content. Their authority is procedural. At this stage, the civilization's memory of loss has been fully transformed into habit. What began as response to catastrophe is now indistinguishable from normality. The Anunnaki, once carriers of memory, now preside over forgetting that does not feel like forgetting. This forgetting is gentle. It does not erase. It settles. It allows life to continue without reopening wounds that can no longer be healed. The system protects itself by smoothing over depths it cannot safely revisit. The cost of this protection is subtle but cumulative. The world becomes thinner. It functions, but it lacks resonance. Meaning is maintained, but it is no longer expansive. The sense that something greater once existed remains only as a faint pressure, an unspoken weight. The Anunnaki absorb this weight. They stand as reminders that order exists even when meaning feels diminished. Their presence reassures by constancy. They do not promise restoration. They promise stability. This promise shapes ethical life profoundly. Right action becomes synonymous with preservation. Wrong action threatens continuity. Moral imagination contracts around the imperative to maintain order. Courage is redefined as endurance. Wisdom as restraint. Such values sustain civilization through prolonged uncertainty. They prevent fragmentation. They encourage cooperation. They allow large populations to coexist within predictable frameworks. The Anunnaki's authority reinforces these values by framing them as cosmic necessities. Yet beneath this success lies a quiet sadness. The civilization has learned to live without expecting fullness. It has accepted incompleteness as the price of survival. The deeper past, whatever richness it held, is no longer pursued. This acceptance is not despair. It is adaptation. It reflects a choice, conscious or not, to prioritize continuity over rediscovery. The Anunnaki, embodying continuity, become symbols of this choice. As time continues, the system's endurance begins to feel almost autonomous. Rituals repeat themselves. Laws renew automatically. The gods' names circulate without conscious engagement. The world runs on inherited momentum. At this point, the Anunnaki's non-firstness becomes essential to their role. They are not tied to a lost origin. They are tied to ongoing function. Their authority does not depend on beginnings. It depends on repetition. The civilization no longer needs to remember why the system exists. It only needs to keep it operating. The gods ensure that operation remains legitimate. They anchor order in a sacred register that discourages questioning. This discouragement is gentle, almost invisible. It works through habit rather than prohibition. People simply do not look beyond the system because there is no incentive to do so. Stability satisfies immediate needs. In this mature phase, civilization resembles a carefully balanced structure built atop buried layers it no longer explores. The surface is orderly. The foundations are deep and unknown. The Anunnaki stand at the junction, connecting visible order to invisible depth without exposing what lies below. They are not guides into the past. They are guards at its threshold. And so the journey continues within this guarded silence. The world persists, organized, cautious, resilient. The gods remain, not as voices calling from the beginning of time, but as steady presences ensuring that what remains continues to hold together, even as the memory of why it was first assembled fades into stillness. As the long arc of Mesopotamian civilization extends toward its later horizons, something subtle begins to shift beneath the surface of continuity. The system still functions, rituals still repeat, and authority still circulates through ancient names, yet a faint dissonance emerges. It is not rebellion, nor collapse, but a quiet misalignment between form and feeling. The structures endure, but the inner conviction that once animated them thins further. This thinning expresses itself as distance. Individuals continue to act correctly, yet their actions feel increasingly external to their inner lives. Ritual is performed with precision, but its emotional resonance weakens. The words are spoken, the gestures completed, the offerings given, yet something remains untouched. The system still governs behavior, but it no longer fully inhabits the soul. The Anunnaki remain present within this distance. Their authority is unchanged, but its texture shifts. They are invoked more often as guarantors of outcome than as embodiments of meaning. Their names appear in contracts, oaths, and formal inscriptions, securing legitimacy rather than inspiring reverence. The gods become instruments of assurance in a world where trust in unseen order must be continually reaffirmed. This transformation reshapes how power is experienced. Kings and officials rely heavily on divine sanction, yet that sanction feels procedural rather than sacred. Authority is maintained through repetition of forms rather than through perceived closeness to the divine. The Anunnaki authorize rule, but they do not enliven it. Governance becomes efficient, predictable, and emotionally neutral. Such neutrality stabilizes society, but it also drains it. When authority no longer carries mystery, obedience becomes habit rather than devotion. People comply because the system functions, not because it resonates deeply. The Anunnaki's presence ensures coherence, but it no longer offers interior anchoring. Literary texts from later periods reflect this subtle hollowing. Voices grow reflective, inward, occasionally resigned. The language turns toward personal endurance rather than collective destiny. Suffering is acknowledged calmly, without expectation of relief. The gods are present, but distant. Their silence mirrors the individual's own withdrawal from cosmic intimacy. This withdrawal does not signal disbelief. It signals accommodation. The civilization has learned to live without expecting fullness from its sacred structures. The Anunnaki are still honored, but the relationship is formal. Faith is expressed through correctness, not intimacy. Meaning resides in continuity, not encounter. Within this environment, memory itself changes character. Earlier generations carried memory as narrative, ritual, and symbol. Now memory becomes archival. Texts are preserved meticulously, copied faithfully, stored carefully. Preservation becomes an end in itself. The act of keeping replaces the act of remembering. The Anunnaki preside over this archival consciousness. Their authority legitimizes preservation without inquiry. Texts are sacred because they are ancient, not because they are understood. The system values survival of form over renewal of meaning. In this way, memory becomes static, insulated from reinterpretation. This insulation protects the civilization from destabilization, but it also isolates it from deeper reflection. The past is revered, but not revisited. Its depth is acknowledged abstractly, but its implications are no longer engaged. The Anunnaki guard this abstraction, ensuring that reverence does not turn into questioning. As a result, the civilization develops an almost administrative relationship with the sacred. The divine becomes a category managed by institutions rather than a presence encountered personally. Temples operate smoothly. Ritual calendars are maintained precisely. The gods receive what is due, yet the encounter remains distant. This distance affects moral imagination. Ethics become procedural, defined by compliance rather than transformation. Goodness means fulfilling one's role correctly. Failure is technical rather than existential. The Anunnaki, associated with order, reinforce this framing. They reward alignment, not aspiration. Over time, this procedural morality produces a society that is remarkably stable, yet emotionally restrained. Passion is moderated. Excess is discouraged. Individual expression is secondary to collective equilibrium. The system functions well, but it leaves little room for inner expansion. The Anunnaki's role in this equilibrium becomes increasingly symbolic. They are no longer perceived as agents acting within history, but as signs that history itself is structured. Their presence confirms that the world remains intelligible. even if its deeper meaning feels distant. This symbolic authority allows the system to persist across cultural transitions. As Mesopotamian influence spreads and transforms under successive empires, the Anunnaki's names adapt, merge, and reappear in new configurations. Their essence survives because it is functional, not narrative. They legitimate order wherever order must be maintained. Yet this adaptability further erodes specificity. The gods lose distinct contours. They become interchangeable within broader frameworks of authority. Their individuality dissolves into institutional presence. What remains is a generalized sense of sacred order rather than personal divinity. This generalization reflects the civilization's own evolution. As it grows more complex, it relies increasingly on abstraction. Systems replace stories. Categories replace experiences. The Anunnaki exemplify this shift. They are less figures within myth than principles embedded within structure. The cost of this shift is subtle but persistent. When principles replace stories, meaning becomes thinner. Stories allow identification, struggle, and transformation. Principles offer stability but little resonance. The civilization chooses stability, accepting the trade-off. This choice is informed by long memory, even if that memory is no longer explicit. Somewhere beneath the layers of form lies the awareness that instability once carried catastrophic cost. The Anunnaki's authority reassures by preventing a return to that unknown depth. They keep the world safely on the surface. As generations pass, this surface becomes all that is known. The idea that something lies beneath fades into abstraction. The Anunnaki, once possible bridges to deeper memory, now function as seals. They close rather than open. This sealing does not feel oppressive. It feels protective. The civilization has learned that some depths are too dangerous to revisit. It chooses to remain within manageable boundaries. The gods support this choice by embodying order without invitation to dissent. In this late stage, the question of origins becomes almost meaningless. The system's success no longer depends on knowing where it came from. It depends on maintaining coherence. The Anunnaki's authority is sufficient for that task. Their non-firstness is irrelevant because firstness itself has lost relevance. What matters is that the system continues to hold. Fields are planted, laws are enforced, rituals are observed, time cycles reliably, the gods remain in place. Life continues. Yet beneath this continuity lies a quiet recognition that something essential has been traded away. The civilization survives, but it no longer expects to feel whole. Completeness belongs to a past too distant to recover. The present is enough, but only just. The Anunnaki stand as symbols of this compromise. They represent the decision to endure rather than to seek. They hold together a world that has accepted its limits. As the journey approaches its final stages, the atmosphere grows increasingly still. Motion continues, but momentum slows. The system maintains itself through inertia as much as intention. The gods remain, steady and impersonal, anchoring a civilization that has learned how to last. The deeper past remains buried, not by force, but by adaptation. Its silence shapes everything without being named. The Anunnaki guard that silence faithfully, ensuring that the world above it remains intact. And so the civilization moves forward, balanced and restrained, guided by gods who no longer promise beginnings or endings, only the continuation of form. In their quiet authority, the long aftermath finds its final shape, enduring not through revelation, but through the careful preservation of what remains. As the final layers of Mesopotamian continuity settle into place, the civilization begins to resemble a structure that persists largely by momentum. The mechanisms of order continue to operate, yet they do so with increasing quietness, as if aware that their purpose is no longer to expand meaning but simply to prevent dissolution. What remains is a world sustained by careful balance, where survival itself has become the central achievement. In this late phase, the relationship between people and tradition becomes almost automatic. Rituals are observed because they are observed. Laws are enforced because they exist. The rhythm of life unfolds within predefined boundaries that few feel compelled to examine. The system's success lies precisely in this lack of examination. By minimizing reflection, it minimizes risk. The Anunnaki remain embedded within this automaticity. Their names circulate through daily transactions, legal formulas, and calendrical observances. They are present everywhere, yet felt nowhere in particular. Their authority no longer derives from story or encounter, but from saturation. They are woven into the fabric of existence so completely that imagining life without them feels unnecessary. This saturation produces a peculiar invisibility. The gods are invoked constantly, yet rarely contemplated. Their presence is assumed, like gravity or time. This assumption removes friction from belief. Faith no longer requires engagement. It functions as background condition. Such background divinity supports a civilization that prioritizes predictability over depth. The unknown is tolerated only insofar as it can be categorized. Mystery is respected, but kept at a safe distance. The Anunnaki, embodying order, act as guardians of this distance. They ensure that the sacred does not overwhelm the system with excess meaning. The emotional tone of life under this arrangement becomes notably even. Extremes are discouraged. Passion is moderated. Suffering is endured quietly. Joy is contained. The system values equilibrium above all else. Emotional regulation mirrors cosmic regulation. The Anunnaki's authority reinforces this mirroring, presenting balance as both divine and necessary. As a result, personal identity aligns closely with role. Individuals define themselves through function rather than aspiration. One is a scribe, a farmer, a priest, a ruler. Fulfillment is found in correct performance, not in self-discovery. The Anunnaki legitimize these roles by embedding them within cosmic order. To perform one's role correctly is to align with the gods. This alignment offers security. It reduces uncertainty. Yet it also narrows the horizon of possibility. Life becomes a sequence of obligations fulfilled competently. The deeper questions of existence recede, not because they are answered, but because they are no longer pursued. In this environment, the memory of origins fades almost completely. What once felt like loss has been absorbed into habit. The civilization does not grieve what it no longer remembers. It simply continues. The Anunnaki, once potential links to earlier depths, now function as stabilizers of this continuation. Their myths, where still preserved, read less like living narratives and more like instructional frameworks. They reinforce norms, they clarify boundaries, they warn against excess. The gods' actions are exemplary rather than dramatic. They model restraint. This modeling extends into political ideology. Authority emphasizes stewardship rather than vision. Leaders present themselves as caretakers of inherited order, not agents of transformation. Their legitimacy rests on maintaining balance, not achieving greatness. The Anunnaki's sanction supports this restrained governance. Such governance is effective in preserving coherence. It avoids extremes. It absorbs shocks gradually. It prioritizes continuity over conquest. Yet it also suppresses the possibility of renewal. Change occurs only when unavoidable, and even then it is framed as preservation. The civilization's longevity testifies to the effectiveness of this strategy. It survives repeated challenges by refusing to overextend. It adapts quietly. It integrates without proclaiming. The Anunnaki's flexible authority facilitates this quiet adaptation, allowing new elements to be absorbed without destabilizing the whole. Yet the cost of this adaptability is a gradual flattening of meaning. As everything becomes manageable, little feels significant. The sacred is everywhere, but nowhere intense. Life is ordered, but rarely luminous. The system holds, but it does not inspire. This lack of inspiration does not lead to collapse. It leads to stillness. The civilization enters a phase where continuation itself is sufficient purpose. The Anunnaki embody this sufficiency. They stand for the idea that order does not need justification beyond its own persistence. In this final stillness, the deeper past becomes fully inaccessible. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is irrelevant. The present no longer requires it. The system functions without reference to beginnings. The Anunnaki's authority does not depend on origin stories. It depends on efficacy. Their non-firstness becomes definitive. They are not remembered as initiators. They are experienced as maintainers. Their role is to keep the world intelligible enough to endure. They succeed in this role precisely because they do not invite exploration beyond what can be sustained. The civilization's relationship with time reflects this closure. Time is measured, regulated, and predictable. Cycles repeat reliably. History becomes a record of maintenance rather than transformation. The future is expected to resemble the past closely enough to remain familiar. Within this familiarity, anxiety is minimized. The world feels contained. Even decline, when it occurs, is gradual and absorbed. The system does not resist change violently. It incorporates it slowly, smoothing edges, preserving core patterns. The Anunnaki's presence assures that this smoothing continues. Their authority remains intact even as specific expressions evolve. They are less characters within myth than constants within process. Their power lies in continuity without narrative demand. As the journey approaches its conclusion, the civilization stands fully within the aftermath of its own endurance. It has outlived its memory of beginning. It has replaced origin with operation. It exists because it continues. This existence is not empty. It is functional, resilient, and stable, yet it is also quiet, restrained, and bounded. The civilization has chosen to survive by limiting depth. The Anunnaki, embodying that choice, remain essential. They do not ask to be understood. They do not offer revelation. They simply hold the structure together. Their authority is unquestioned because it is unobtrusive. It does not demand belief. It assumes it. In this late phase, the world no longer seeks meaning beyond itself. It maintains itself through repetition, alignment, and careful management of uncertainty. The Anunnaki preside over this maintenance, silent and effective. What began as a response to loss has become a perfected system of survival. The loss itself has dissolved into background. Only its consequences remain, shaping a civilization that has learned how to endure without looking back. And so the journey moves toward its final quiet. The system holds. The gods remain. The world continues, balanced within limits it no longer questions, sustained by figures who were never first, yet became indispensable by ensuring that what followed could last. At the far edge of this long continuum, where endurance has replaced memory and structure has replaced origin, the Sumerian world settles into a final, quiet clarity. What remains is not a revelation nor a collapse, but a steady awareness that civilization itself is an act of balancing on absence. The past does not return, it does not speak, it simply supports everything that stands above it, unseen and unacknowledged. In this stillness, the Anunnaki occupy their last and most complete role. They are no longer interpreters of mystery, nor mediators between heaven and earth, in any intimate sense. They have become the grammar of order itself. Their presence is woven into timing, measurement, authority, and expectation. They exist wherever alignment is preserved, and disappear wherever it fails. They are not remembered as beings who arrived, but as conditions that persist. This final form of divinity is almost invisible. It does not demand belief. It does not inspire devotion. It functions. Its success lies in how little attention it requires. The Anunnaki do not need to be imagined vividly. They are assumed quietly. Their authority operates beneath awareness, like the foundations of a building that no longer draws the eye. Such invisibility marks the completion of a long adaptation. What began as response to rupture has matured into a system that no longer feels like response at all. Civilization no longer experiences itself as living after something. It experiences itself simply as living. The weight of loss has been distributed so evenly across structure that it no longer presses on consciousness. And yet, the shape of that loss remains legible in everything that endures, in the restraint of ethics, in the moderation of ambition, in the preference for repetition over revelation. These are not accidental traits. They are the residue of a decision made long ago, whether consciously or not, to survive by narrowing rather than expanding. The Anunnaki embody this decision perfectly. They are not expansive gods. They do not open new worlds. They stabilize the existing one. Their power is conservative in the deepest sense, preserving form against dissolution. They stand for the idea that continuity itself is sacred, even when meaning has thinned. In this final view, the question of whether the Anunnaki were first dissolves entirely. Firstness belongs to a mode of thinking no longer relevant here. Origins matter when growth is the goal. In a civilization oriented toward endurance, what matters is reliability. The Anunnaki are reliable. They maintain the system. That is enough. The deeper past, whatever it contained, has been fully absorbed into this reliability. Its absence no longer disturbs the surface. The civilization does not long for recovery. It has learned to function without wholeness. The idea of completeness has been replaced by sufficiency. This sufficiency shapes the emotional climate of the world's final stage. Life is steady, predictable, manageable. People understand their roles and perform them well. There is little surprise, little wonder, but also little chaos. The system delivers what it promises: continuity. Within that continuity, meaning becomes quieter. It does not erupt in moments of revelation. It settles into habit. Meaning is found in doing what must be done, in keeping the cycle intact, in ensuring that tomorrow resembles today closely enough to feel safe. The Anunnaki preside over this quiet meaning. They are not asked for insight. They are asked for balance. Their favour ensures that the rhythm holds. Their displeasure signals misalignment. They function as indicators rather than interlocutors. This functional divinity allows the civilization to persist far beyond what memory alone could sustain. It carries forward through generations that no longer know why the system exists, only that it does. The Anunnaki legitimize this persistence by standing above explanation. At this point, the civilization's story becomes almost complete in its restraint. It has closed itself against destabilizing depth. It has chosen not to excavate what lies beneath its foundations. It has accepted the trade-off between endurance and fullness. This acceptance is neither tragic nor triumphant. It is pragmatic. It reflects an understanding that some losses cannot be recovered without risking further collapse. The safest path is to build above them and move on. The Anunnaki, in their final form, are the guardians of that safety. They ensure that the buried past remains buried. They keep the system oriented forward, even as it avoids looking back. Their silence is protective, and yet silence has a quality of its own. It shapes perception even when it is not noticed. The absence beneath the structure gives the structure its tension, its carefulness, its moderation. The civilization's character is moulded by what it no longer touches. In this sense, the Anunnaki are not merely gods of order, they are gods of aftermath. They preside over a world that has already learned the cost of instability. They embody the wisdom of limits. As the journey ends, there is no final revelation waiting. No hidden tablet emerges to explain what came before. The Sumerian texts do not resolve their own silences. They leave them intact, woven into the fabric of what follows. The legacy they pass on is not an answer, but a posture, a way of existing within uncertainty without demanding resolution, a method of sustaining coherence when origins are inaccessible. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this legacy, not as creators, but as stabilizers, not as first beings, but as enduring ones. Their importance lies precisely in their placement after something else, something that shaped them as much as they shaped what followed. Civilization, seen from this final vantage, is revealed not as a triumph of beginnings, but as a long negotiation with loss. It is the art of continuing without fully knowing why continuation became necessary. The Sumerian world mastered that art early. It refined it patiently. It built institutions, rituals, and gods capable of carrying absence without collapsing under its weight. And so the story closes not with certainty, but with balance. Not with origin, but with continuation. The Anunnaki remain, steady and silent, holding together a world that no longer asks where it began, only how it can remain aligned long enough to endure another turning of time. In that endurance, the mystery is not solved, it is preserved.